This flavorful five-color deck presents an absolutely perfect balance and representation of color among the 10 two-color pairs in Magic. The spells in this build are comprised of 60 two-color cards, 6 from each of the 10 guilds. Each set of these 6 guild cards are composed of 2 legendary creatures, 2 forms of disruption, 1 form of card advantage, and 1 form of overall game enhancement. Through the composition of this deck, Niv-Mizzet's Enter the Battlefield trigger is optimized, allowing us to draw as many cards as possible. Victory is achieved through combat and/or commander damage. Admittedly, this deck's existence is a triumph of flavor and should not be considered uber competitive. However, as more and more powerful two-color spells are printed, this build has the potential to become more dominant with each passing set.
Niv-Mizzet Reborn is a 6/6 legendary dragon avatar with flying for WUBRG colors. When Niv-Mizzet Reborn enters the battlefield, we reveal the top 10 cards of our library. For each color pair, we choose a card that's exactly those colors from among them, put the chosen cards into our hand, and the rest on the bottom of our library in a random order. There are many warped and deranged ways to make a Niv-Mizzet Reborn EDH commander deck. This is not one of those. This is a deck that is bursting with guild flavor. We have 1 commander, 39 lands, and 60 cards. Of the 60 cards, there is a direct equal representation across all guilds. Comprised of those 60 cards are 6 cards from each of the 10 guilds of Ravnica, and we're about to see where each of those cards lie in this deck tech. This group of cards is considered to be our beatdown creatures. There is 1 creature from each of the 10 guilds in this section. Qualifications to meet the requirements of being included in this section of the deck: you must be a legendary creature, and you must be the most powerful creature you can be in your guild. And that, of course, is all subjective. That's through the eyes of MTG Burgeoning. These are the creatures that we will send into combat. These creatures are going to help pave the way to victory. Starting with our allied colored pairs and then working to our enemy colored pairs, we begin with Azorius and Dragon Lord Ojutai, a 5/4 legendary elder dragon with flying for 3, a white, and a blue mana. Dragon Lord Ojutai has hexproof as long as it's untapped, which is fantastic because it acts as a nice beefy blocker for 5 mana, and it can avoid spot removal as long as it's untapped. Whenever Dragon Lord Ojutai deals combat damage to a player, we look at the top 3 cards of our library. We put 1 of them into our hand and the rest in the bottom of our library in any order. The fact that Dragon Lord Ojutai has the evasion of flying means that we should be able to safely send it into combat outside of the worries of spot removal. If Dragon Lord Ojutai hits a couple of times and activates its combat damage trigger, all the better in order to continue to have Dragon Lord Ojutai be the Azorius representative in this Guilds Matters deck. We're up to Dimir, and the Dimir representative is Una, Queen of the Fae, a 5/5 legendary fairy wizard with flying for 3 and any combination of Dimir mana. We can pay X and 1 Dimir mana, which is either blue or black, and choose a color. Target opponent exiles the top X cards of their library from the game. For each card of the chosen color removed this way, we create a 1/1 blue and black fairy rogue creature token with flying. So Una by itself is a beefy 5/5 flyer, which is going to be great to send combat damage right to our opponents, flying right over their ground walkers on the battlefield. As you'll notice as we get further into this section of the deck tech, all of the beatdown creatures have some sort of evasion as a way in which to make their threat even more imminent. Now for Una, Aside from her flying and her 5/5 beefiness for 6 overall mana, we also have the opportunity to thin out our opponent's libraries depending on how much mana we decide to channel into Una's activated ability. If we get lucky enough to hit some of the cards of the chosen color, we create additional evasive creatures as 1/1 flying black and blue fairy rogue creature tokens, or we have chump blockers for days. Either way, Una is the best the Dimir Guild has to offer. All right, next up we have the Rakdos Guild, and here we're going back to Dragons of Tarkir. Dragon Lord Kolaghan. 6/5 legendary elder dragon with flying and haste for 4 and 1 Rakdos color. It's black and red. Other creatures we control have haste. Now, for the purposes of this deck, that's pretty much all Dragon Lord Kolaghan is going to bring to the table, because outside of one of the decks that features cards like Shadowborn Apostles, or the Relentless Rats, or the Rat Colony, or the Persistent Petitioners, his last ability is going to fall into the realm of non-relevant, because whenever an opponent casts a creature or planeswalker spell with the same name as a card in their graveyard, that player loses 10 life, because EDH, of course, is a singleton format, that ability most likely is going to whiff every time. However, when Dragon Lord Kolaghan comes down with evasion as the flying, and it has haste and gives other creatures we control haste, Dragon Lord Kolaghan, as you'll see as we move further and further into this deck tech, he will end up being one of the most powerful creatures in the 99. Now, next up is Gruul, and we're sticking with Dragons of Tarkir, and we are going to go with Dragon Lord Atarka, a legendary Elder Dragon, 8/8 with flying and trample for 5 and Gruul colors. When Dragon Lord Atarka ETBs, it deals 5 damage divided as we choose among any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers our opponents control. So Dragon Lord Atarka can hit the field, spread 5 points of damage around to probably a bunch of different, maybe mana dorks or some chump blockers, or maybe there are some planeswalkers that are close to alting. I know in my meta group, planeswalkers run rampant, so getting Dragon Lord Atarka down to get some direct damage to some planeswalkers, well, that's just the icing on top of the cake. However, an 8/8 flying trampler, whoo baby, for 5 and 2 mana, for 5 and a red and a green for a total of 7 mana value, Dragon Lord Atarka is absolutely the jewel of the Gruul clan. Next up in our last allied colored pairing, this one is Selesnya. We have Sigarda, Host of Herons. 2 a green and 2 white for a 5/5 angel with flying and hexproof. Spells and abilities our opponents control can't cause us to sacrifice permanents. That's a very good thing, because All is Dust is a very, very real removal spell in my metagame, and Sigarda, Host of Herons, with her presence on the battlefield, it's going to make sure that we won't have to sacrifice any permanents because of one of our opponents casting All is Dust. And the built-in hexproof is fantastic as a way in which to ward off any spot removal. Again, as you see, more evasion in the form of flying. So we've got 5 creatures in our beatdown section. All of them have flying, in addition to some other very, very valuable built-in conditions. Now let's move with our enemy colored pairings. We're going to begin with Orzhov, and one would think that there would be a lot of different Orzhov considerations for the beatdown section of this deck tech. However, upon perusing what Orzhov has to offer in that realm, there are not very many big options, particularly when we're looking for beatdown legendary creatures that also offer evasion. So MTG Burgeoning decided to settle on Teysa, Envoy of Ghosts, a 4/4 legendary human advisor with vigilance and protection from creatures for 5 in Orzhov colors. The protection from creatures gives us our evasion. The vigilance is also nice too, because she can go into combat, attack without being blocked because she has protection from creatures, and then also sit back and be a blocker to any ground threats as well. However, her bottom wall of text may be even more valuable. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to us, we destroy that creature, and then we create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying. So Tasa's presence on the battlefield, even though I do believe she's overcosted with a mana value of 7, what she presents as an attacker, what she presents as a blocker, and what she presents for our side of defense against our opponent's attacks, it's just too valuable to ignore Teysa being included in the 99 of this deck. Her presence alone would make opponents consider, do I really want to send my creature into combat, have it destroyed, even though it will bring our life total down, and then we get to create another evasive creature that can be sent into combat via flying, or that can just chump block. Teysa, Envoy of Ghosts, gives our opponents many, many headaches if we can get her out onto the battlefield. All right, next up, we are going Boros here, and really for the beatdown feature of Boros, it's really a selection between 1 or 2 creatures. I mean, let me reframe that. It's really a selection of 1 of 2 different creatures. Even though option 1B did not make it into this section, that does not mean we will not see her later. So, representing Boros in this section of the deck tech, we have Aurelia the War Leader, a 3/4 legendary angel with flying, vigilance, and haste for 2 red, and 2 white. Whenever Aurelia attacks for the first time each turn, we untap all creatures we control, and after this phase, there is an additional combat phase. Aurelia can hit the battlefield quickly, send her and any other creatures we have that can attack into combat, and of course, if we've got some evasive creatures out there, we're going to swing for some big-time damage. Aurelia will allow us to untap all of our creatures to send them in for another combat if they've already attacked, or to just sit back and I'll wait for our opponents on the crackback. Whether we're going full offensive or trying to play combat tricks, Aurelia the War Leader is the Boros choice in this section of the deck tech. Next up, we are at Izzet, and Izzet was similar to Orzhov with the selection process of what is a beatdown creature going to do for us? We need to find a legendary creature. There has to be some kind of evasion. And, well, I think we made a fantastic choice with the Locust God. The Locust God is a 4/4 legendary god with flying for 4 and Izzet colors. Whenever we draw a card, we create a 1/1 blue and red insect creature token with flying and haste. So similar to Una, we have a flyer that can create other flyers, and that's going to be very helpful in a deck where our only path to victory is going to be combat. Remember, this deck is constructed based upon its flavor, not its power level. So we can tap 2 and pay Izzet colors to draw a card and discard a card, and whenever the Locust God dies, we return it to our hand at the beginning of the next end step. So we have a threat that really can't leave the game unless somebody exiles it, because if it dies, it just comes back to our hand. We have a flying creature that makes additional flyers, and we have a built-in way to draw cards. The Locust God seems like a slam dunk as the Izzet representative of the beatdown feature of this deck tech. All right, next up we have Simic. Now, before we present the selection for the Simic beatdown creature, I have to express a modicum of disappointment in the guild itself. And that's not for any of the archetypes that Simic presents, of course. It's because, for the purposes of this selection process, legendary beatdown creatures in Simic, they really don't exist. If we peruse throughout Magic's history, there are just no creatures that really fit the mold of any of our previous 8 examples. So we decided to go the big route that has a potential payoff if the conditions are right on the battlefield. I present to you Prime Speaker Zagana, a 1/1 legendary merfolk wizard for 2 green, and 2 blue. You'll notice right away there are no keywords on Zagana. There is no evasion for Zagana. There's no flying, there's no trample, there's no kind of land walk. Boy, how I wish Hydroid Krasis was a legendary creature. But alas, this is the guild selection for this particular part of the deck. So when Prime Speaker Zagana ETBs, it ETBs with X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the greatest power among other creatures we control. When Prime Speaker Zagana enters the battlefield, we draw cards equal to its power. So if we're fortunate enough to have one of our previously showcased biggins out on the battlefield, and we put Prime Speaker Zagana into play, at least we'll have a very, very big, beefy creature. Of course, it is evasionless. However, the drawback that we're going to hedge against its lack of evasion is going to be filling our hand with lots and lots of cards. I will put this caveat on the shoulders of Prime Speaker Zagana. The moment a big Simic legendary beatdown creature with evasion becomes available, Prime Speaker Zagana may go way of the dinosaurs. In, Earth, not in Magic. Alright, and last, we have the Golgari Guild. And Golgari, for green and black, again, I'm a little disappointed with their offerings for legendary evasive beatdown creatures. I do wish in this instance that the Spirit Monger were a legendary creature. That would have made the selection process so much easier. So very similar to Prime Speaker Zagana, the moment that Golgari unleashes a big evasion-filled beatdown legendary creature, then that means that our current incumbent, Storev Devkaren Lich, is going to go way of the Dodo Bird. Alright, so Storev is a 5/4 legendary zombie elf wizard with trample, so there's some form of evasion, for 1, 2 black and a green. Whenever Storev deals combat damage to a player or a planeswalker, we return to our hand target creature or planeswalker card in our graveyard that wasn't put there this combat. So to hedge against the 5/4 trampling for only 4 mana, which on its surface is not bad numbers, 4 overall mana for a 5/4 with trample, the recursive effect definitely helps the lack of other big-time game-breaking abilities that we've seen with the first 8 creatures included in this deck tech thus far. So Storev and Prime Speaker Zagana, they are the incumbents of their guilds right now, but that may change. The next group of cards in this deck tech are referred to as our auxiliary creatures. These are 10 creatures that are included in the 99 that help out the battlefield, that help out our board state, that help out our gameplay in one form or another. The qualifications for entering into this particular part of the deck tech: each creature from each guild must be legendary, and it must, through the eyes of MTG Burgeoning, be the best at what it does. It has to be the one creature from the guild that helps out the overall deck the best. And this is what we're going to do, very similar to our beatdown creatures. We are going to begin with our allied colors and then work to our enemy colors. First, we begin with Azorius, and that's going to be Wrath Capuchin, a ship's mage. We have a 3/3 legendary human wizard with flash flying for 2 in Azorius colors. We may cast historic spells as though they had flash. So far, every single card that we've showcased on this deck tech, including every card in this section, are legendaries. And before we get done with this deck tech, you're going to see a lot more legendaries added to this list. I will put out there as a spoiler, we will not have any sagas, and we will not have any artifacts. This is a straight guild build, so we will not have any artifacts in this deck. So we can look at Wrath Capuchin as a way in which to include a Vidalcan Orrery specific to our legendary spells. Plus it being a flash flyer for 3/3, it allows us to put in a nice surprise chump blocker if needed, or a nice end of an opponent's turn casting so that we can replenish our hand if we're planning to cast a bunch of historic spells during our next turn. The Dimir representative in this in this portion of the deck tech is Lazav, the Multifarious, a 1/3 legendary shapeshifter for Dimir colors. When it ETBs, we surveil one, and for anyone who's unfamiliar with the surveil mechanic, that means that we look at the top card of our library and we may put it into our graveyard. So it's kind of like a variation on Scry, as opposed to putting that card from the top of our library onto the bottom. We may choose to put it into our graveyard. So the surveil one helps us to have a little micro filtering of the top of our library. However, we can pay X, and Lazav the Multifarious becomes a copy of target creature card in our graveyard with converted mana cost X. Except its name is Lazav the Multifarious, it's legendary in addition to its other types, and it retains this ability. So Lazav helps out the deck with a form of not necessarily creature recursion, but with the ability to shapeshift to a creature that's in our graveyard. If our opponents are oh so happy that they got rid of our Aurelia, guess what? Lazav can come down, and then we can turn Lazav into a copy of Aurelia. So Lazav the Multifarious is going to be the Dimir representative in this portion of the deck tech, and what it does, no other creature can do in this deck. All right, our next guild is Rakdos, and we are going to talk about Olivia Valdarin. This is OG Olivia, the first of her kind. She's a 3/3 legendary vampire with flying for 2 in Rakdos colors. We can pay 1 in a red, and she deals 1 point of damage to another target creature. That creature becomes a vampire in addition to its other types, and we put a +1/+1 counter on Olivia. Then we can pay 3 and 2 black mana to gain control of target vampire for as long as we control Olivia. There's so much to unpack about this offering from Rakdos. Let's begin with the basics. She's a 3/3 flyer for 4 mana. That's aces in this book, particularly because of the presence of her evasion. Remember, our primary, secondary, tertiary, every form of win condition is going to come in combat for this deck. Let's also move on to the middle block of text. She acts as a pinger. Now, granted, it's going to cost us 2 mana for each ping. However, this rids the battlefield of any potential chump blockers. It rids the battlefield of any mana dorks. And if we don't really want to get rid of creatures, then we can just make them turn into vampires for a later thievery, which we'll talk about in a moment. Each point of damage that we deal to these creatures just makes Olivia bigger and bigger. Those +1/+1 counters can add up, particularly in a deck where we should not have any trouble balancing our mana. And then lastly, for 3 and 2 black, we're going to gain control of a vampire for as long as we control Olivia. So we can load up on our opponent's creatures by borrowing them through the theft of Olivia's first and second abilities combined. Olivia Valdarin can do it all. She can attack, she can kill, she can steal. She is the Rakdos representative in this portion of the deck tech. All right, next up we have Gruul, and we are going to include Xenagos, God of Revels. Xenagos is a 6/5 legendary enchantment creature, a god, who is indestructible for 3 in a red and blue mana. As long as our devotion to red and green is less than 7, Xenagos is not a creature. Of course, devotion means as long as our Gruul mana symbols are less than 7, Xenagos will remain an indestructible enchantment. And if you thought an indestructible creature was difficult to deal with, try removing an indestructible enchantment from the battlefield. That provides so many obstacles that if not a creature, Xenagos usually sticks to the battlefield for the entirety of a game. At the beginning of combat on our turn, another target creature we control gains haste and gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is that creature's power. So you've seen the number of big, beefy evasion creatures that we have. Xenagos will double their power and their toughness and send them into combat, even hasty if need be. Xenagos is going to help us enhance our primary and secondary and tertiary win conditions, which is combat. And what more would you expect from a Gruul representative? All right, our last ally-colored pairing is Selesnya, and that is going to be Captain Sisay. A 2/2 legend for 2 in Selesnya colors. We can tap her and search our library for a legend or legendary card, reveal it, and put it into our hand. Captain Sisay can do a lot of damage as long as we can untap with her, and she does not attract spot removal. I will say, historically, she is a lightning rod for attention, particularly in a deck that is just inundated with legendary creatures and legendary permanents. More on that later in the deck tech. Either way, Captain Sisay helps to enhance our deck by allowing us to act as our library, to use our library as a toolbox. We can tap her and tutor up the legendary card that we need most at the time during the game. All right, now we're up to our Orzhov creature. Now we're off to our we're up to our enemy-colored creatures, and now we're going to begin with Orzhov. And this time we're going to talk about Campbell, Council of Allocation. 2/2 legendary human advisor for 1 in Orzhov colors. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, that player loses 2 life, and we gain 2 life. Seems very innocuous. Seems very non-threatening. Seems like we could cast Campbell, and then it doesn't really get a lot of attention. It gets looked over, it gets ignored, until, 3 or 4 rounds around the table, and suddenly we've gained 20 life, and our opponents combined have lost 20. Campbell's presence is sneaky on the battlefield because it just looks so non-threatening as a 2/3. I guarantee you, however, when the life starts draining and the life starts gaining, Campbell will start to attract more and more attention. Campbell's presence in the deck is going to help enhance the withering of our opponent's life totals to help make combat that much simpler. Speaking of making combat simpler and getting to the end of the game much quicker, introducing our Boros representative. This was the 1B to Aurelia's 1A. And that's Gisela, Blade of Gold Knight. She's a 5/5 legendary angel with flying and first strike for 4, a red, and 2 white mana. If a source would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, that source deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. Be very careful when you read that text because it does not specify that the damage has to be from us. If opponent 1 attacks opponent 2, Gisela's ability is going to trigger, and opponent 1 is going to deal double damage to opponent number 2. Don't miss those combat triggers with Gisela on the battlefield. And lastly, if a source would deal damage to us or a permanent we control, we prevent half that damage rounded up. Gisela is our game breaker, particularly when you look at all of the big, beefy, evasive creatures that we've already showcased during this deck tech. We slam down Gisela onto the table, and if she sticks, generally, victory is ours. All right, 3 creatures to go. Next up, we have Izzet, and we have Joyra, the Weatherlight Captain, a 3/3 legendary human artificer for 2 in Izzet colors. Whenever we cast a historic spell, draw a card. Boy, that sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Maybe not. However, if we have this out there onto the battlefield and we are casting our creature spells, and let's be honest, we have a lot of legendary creatures. We're going to have some other legendary cards coming up soon, but again, no artifacts and no sagas at this point. Joyra is going to help with the deck. It's going to help us out by replenishing cards in our hand each time we decide to cast one of our historic spells. And I can promise you, Joyra, in conjunction with Wrath Capuchin, allowing us to cast our historic spells with Flash and then draw a card off of Joyra, very, very nice engine of value with those 2 creatures on the battlefield simultaneously. Speaking of value, I present the Simic representative of this portion of the deck tech, Rashmi, Eternity's Crafter, a 2/3 legendary elf druid for 2 and Simic colors. Whenever we cast our first spell each turn, we reveal the top card of our library. If it's a non-land card with CMC less than that spell's, we may cast it without paying its mana cost. If we don't, we draw that card. You've seen how many beefy creatures we've already had, And we haven't even gotten to some of the other non-creature spells. Rash Me allows us to either replace a card that we just cast from our hand or cast a free spell off of the top of our library. Rash Me is going to help us enhance what we're doing in the deck, and that is getting creatures into play and trying to win via combat. And the nice potential for card draw is just as good. And lastly, we have the Golgari representative, and that is going to be Ikra Shadiki the Usurper, a 3/7 legendary Naga wizard with menace for 3 in Golgari colors. Whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, we gain life equal to that creature's toughness. So, admittedly, in a flavorful deck such as this, and we are bursting with every flavor under the sun in this guild build, we are going to benefit from either a very quick victory in combat, or we're going to have to draw out the game for as long as we can because we have no other options to win via attacking our opponents. So a card like Ikra Shadiki will allow us to extend the game if necessary by gaining life by any creatures that deal combat damage to our opponents, dependent on those creatures' toughnesses. Sometimes Ikra's presence on the battlefield is very, very valuable. Other times, I wish we had a better utility creature. So similar to what we talked about in the previous segment of this deck tech with respect to Storev and with respect to Prime Speaker Zagana, Ikra Shadiki may be one of those creatures on the hot seat if Golgari produces a legendary auxiliary creature that can offer more to the overall balance and direction of this 5-color deck. Our next group of cards are centered on removal and disruption, and there are going to be 2 forms of removal and disruption from each guild. Now, disruption and removal can be a very broad term, so the removal and disruption spells and effects that we're going to present are very versatile and very multifaceted. 2 forms from each guild, beginning with our allied colors and then moving on to our enemy colors. We begin with Azorius. And we begin with Teferi Time Raveler, our first non-creature spell of this deck tech. And please notice, as we were alluding to earlier in this deck tech, legendary Planeswalker. Legendaries count as historic spells, so this is going to be triggered, or we are able to use this to draw a card off of Joyra, and we're also able to use the casting of Planeswalkers with Flash with Wrath Capuchin. I don't necessarily know the benefits of doing that, but we can do it. All right, Teferi Time Raveler is a Planeswalker for 1 in Azorius colors and enters the battlefield with 4 loyalty counters. Now let's disrupt our opponents by allowing them to cast spells only anytime they can cast a sorcery. So you have some instants in your hand you want to cast? Well, you can do so just during your main phase with the stack empty. We can +1 Teferi Time Raveler, and until our next turn, we may cast sorcery spells as though they had flash. So you know Teferi's coming in, and like his title says, he's unraveling time all over the place. So if disruption wasn't enough, how about some bounce removal by taking 3 loyalty counters off of Teferi to return up to 1 target artifact, creature, or enchantment to its owner's hand, and then we draw a card. Now, we could use that last ability on one of our creatures as a way in which to gain a benefit by getting another enter the battlefield trigger, particularly with Niv-Mizzet Reborn. The entire purpose of this deck was to maximize the number of cards drawn from Niv-Mizzet Reborn's Enter the Battlefield trigger. With Teferi Time Raveler on the battlefield and under our control, we can bounce Niv back to our hand and then cast Niv again to continuously fill our hand and getting those oh so awesome guild-specific cards. All right, so Teferi Time Raveler. It is Disruption spell number 1 and Azorius spell number 1. Number 2, we have Time Wipe. It's a sorcery, our first of the deck tech. 2 white and a blue. We return a creature we control to its owner's hand, then destroy all creatures. So because of our beefiness on the battlefield with respect to our beat down creatures that we talked about earlier in this video, we're generally going to return one of those creatures to our hand so that we don't have to worry about finding some way to get it out of the graveyard later. However, similar to what we talked about with Teferi's last Planeswalker ability, if we have Niv-Mizzet out on the battlefield and the battlefield's looking a little, I don't know, cluttered on our opponent's side, then we can cast Time Wipe and bring Niv-Mizzet back to our hand, wipe the board, and then cast Nivy again later in the game, therefore reaping additional benefits to those sweet, sweet guild cards. And yes, I am aware that for one less mana, we could have included, what is that stinking card? The Destroy All Creatures, the spell can't be countered. The white and the blue, it'll come to me at another time, but I want to be able to return a creature to my hand, so that's why Time Wipe is included over Supreme Verdict. Alright, now we're moving to Dimir, our first Dimir spell for removal and disruption. Tyrant Scorn, our first instant of the deck tech. For Dimir colors, we have a modal spell. We pick one. We destroy target creature with converted mana cost 3 or less, or we return target creature to its owner's hand. We can use this for defensive purposes. We can use this on the offensive. We can use this with combat tricks. Tyrant Scorn is a very underloved and underutilized disruption spell. It needs some more love. And disruption removal spell number 2 from Dimir, it is Recoil. Instant speed for 1 in Dimir colors. We return target permanent to its owner's hand, then that player discards a card. So this is Tyrant Scorn without the ability to destroy a creature, however with a great deal more versatility by returning any permanent to its owner's hand. The having that player discard a card effect is also a nice benefit to go along with Recoil. Rakdos offers us one of the best charms in the game. Rakdos Charm, instant speed, Rakdos colors, modal spell. We pick one of the following 3. Exile all cards from target player's graveyard. Remind me, is EDH a format rife with graveyard shenanigans? Probably. Number 2, destroy target artifact. Are there uber powerful and overwhelmingly devastating artifacts in our format? Check yes. And lastly, number 3, each creature deals 1 damage to its controller. Do EDH players love to have tribal builds and or token decks? Check, check, and check. Rakdos Charm, in my opinion, is the best charm in our format. And Rakdos removal spell number 2, it is Bedevil. Instant speed, double black, 1 red, destroy target artifact, destroy target creature, or destroy target planeswalker. Now, there was a time that this spot was held by Terminate, which is also an instant for 1 black and 1 red that just said destroy target creature, it cannot be regenerated. I figured once Bedevil hit the scene for 1 additional black mana, it offers us the versatility of touching an artifact or a planeswalker. Bedevil took over Terminate's spot and hasn't looked back since. Alright, next up we have Gruul, and on sorcery we have Hull Breach, red and a green. It's a modal spell. We choose 1. We destroy target artifact, or we destroy target enchantment, or we destroy target artifact and target enchantment. For just 2 mana, we can pick off an artifact and an enchantment. Hull Breach, similar to Tyrant Scorn, is one of the most underutilized spells in the format. Hull Breach is awesome. So let's tick up the power level with our Gruul removal and disruption spells, and let's talk about Decimate. 2, a red and a green at sorcery speed. Destroy target artifact, destroy target creature, destroy target enchantment, and destroy target land. Now, a slight caveat when considering casting this spell. You must have a legal target when you cast the spell for each of the 4 permanent types listed on the card. However, once you cast the spell and all 4 targets are legal, if an opponent decides to try to remove one of those targets from the battlefield for the purposes of trying to have Decimate fizzle, That will not be the case. Example, we cast Decimate and have a legal target for an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, and a land. In response to our sorcery speed removal, an opponent decides to blow up the artifact that we targeted, hoping that the spell for Decimate will fizzle. That will not be the case. The creature, enchantment, and land will still be destroyed, and Decimate will resolve successfully. You just got to make sure you have 4 legal targets when you tap that mana. Alright, we have Selesnya as the last of our allied colored disruption and removal spells. Aura Shards. We knew what was coming as soon as we got into a guild-specific removal disruption segment of a deck tech. You knew Aura Shards was coming. 1 and Selesnya colors for an enchantment. When a creature comes into play under our control, we may destroy target artifact or enchantment. That may offers us the world of opportunities when it comes to politicking at the commander table. Or we just take the role of arch enemy and blow up everything. Aura Shards is one of the best removal spells in our format. Our last Selesnya spell, it is the Sylvan Reclamation. Instant speed, 3 in Selesnya colors. We can exile up to 2 target artifacts and or enchantments. Now, yes, the cost is a bit high, being overall 5 mana. However, we're in EDH. We recur things out of the graveyard like we draw cards from the top of our library, particularly when thinking about how dangerous some artifacts and enchantments are in our format. Exiling makes it that much more difficult to get those cards back. And this card is also considered because of its potential for basic land cycling. We are playing a deck where every single spell is multicolored. Every single spell is at least 2 colors outside of our commander. So if we need to fix our mana and we don't necessarily need to keep Sylvan Reclamation for its exiling purposes, we can pay 2, discard it, and search our library for a basic land and then put it into our hand. Either through removal by exile or by basic land cycling, Sylvan Reclamation is versatile enough to include as one of Selesnya's disruption and removal spells. All right, next up we are moving to Orzhov. We have 10 spells left here, and the first one we're going to talk about has the greatest flavor text in the history of Magic. We have Anguished Unmaking, instant speed, 1 and Orzhov colors. We exile target non-land permanent. We lose 3 life. The 3 life should be inconsequential to us in a format where we begin with 40. Choosing any non-land permanent to exile, well, that just makes this spell that much more valuable. All right, and if we're talking about exiling and we're still in Orzhov, then you knew it was only a matter of time until we talked about Merciless Eviction. Sorcery speed, 4 in Orzhov colors. We choose one of the following 4 modes. Exile all artifacts, exile all creatures, exile all enchantments, or exile all planeswalkers. Keeping in mind, as we discussed earlier in this deck tech, there are no artifacts in this build, so Merciless Eviction could be cast by exiling all artifacts and will leave our board completely untouched. All right, after Orzhov, we move to Boros, and in my opinion, the second best charm in our format. In all of Magic, it is Boros Charm. Boros colors, 3 modes. We pick 1, 4 damage to target player, which in a format where we begin with 40 life, it's not really going to do too much overall damage. However, the following 2 modes are much more popular. Permanents we control are indestructible this turn. This can save from any kinds of board wipes, any kinds of spot removals, particularly to one of our big, beefy, evasive creatures that's going in for combat. Speaking of big, beefy, evasive creatures going into combat, mode number 3 says target creature gains double strike until end of turn. So although the first mode is not as, overly powerful as the following 2, all 3 at some point could be used in a game just in my opinion, not to the overall enhancement, to the overall, fundamentals of what Rakdos Charm can offer, which is why I think Boros is number 2. All right. Disruption. Now we've been talking a lot more about removal than we have disruption. Now let's focus on some disruption with Boros' second offering, and that's Master Warcraft. Instant speed 2 and any combination of 2 Boros mana. The restriction here is we only cast Master Warcraft before attackers are declared. We choose which creatures attack this turn, and we choose how each creature blocks this turn. This is a game-winning card for us, particularly because we are trying to win via combat. We can use this for defensive purposes. We can send opponents' creatures at opponents. We can send our creatures at opponents and not have them blocked. Master Warcraft is one of our combat-driven win conditions, and it's one of the cards we look to try to end the game. All right, next we're up to Simic, and Simic is going to present us with a couple of X spells, and that's going to begin with Invoke the Firemind. Sorcery speed, X, 2 blue and a red, and we pick one of the following 2 modes. Either we draw X cards, or Invoke the Firemind. It deals X damage to target creature or player. So if we're low on cards, we can fill up our hand, or we can remove, hopefully, a creature from the battlefield, or maybe even more likely, we can remove a player from the game. And our last Simic offer, our last Izzet, we haven't hit Simic yet, our last Izzet offering is Expansion Explosion. We have a a split card. We have a split card here. So let's talk about expansion. For any combination of 2 Izzet mana, we can copy target instant or sorcery spell with converted mana cost 4 or less. We may choose new targets for the copy. So if we just slide Expansion Explosion over to the side here for a moment, let's look at some of the instant or sorcery spells that we would want to target with expansion. How about a Tyrant Scorn, or a Recoil, or Rakdos Charm, or Bedevil, or how about Hull Breach, or how about doubling up with a Decimate, or what about a second Anguished Unmaking, or how about another Boros Charm. Expansion is one of the best spells that we can include for a way in which to disrupt anything that we're doing, or for a way in which to help disrupt our opponents. It's just so great. I mean, it doesn't even have to be one of our instant or sorcery spells. That's what makes Expansion such a great card to add in this guild build. All right, so let's move over to Explosion. Explosion is X, 2 blue and 2 red. It deals X damage to any target, which means it could be a creature, a player, or a planeswalker. And then target player draws X cards. So we remove something from the battlefield, and then we can replace this card, and hopefully many more cards in our hand if X is high enough. Expansion Explosion is one of the best disruption removal spells we have in the 99. All right, we're up to Simic. We have 4 spells left in this section of the deck tech, and Simic is going to give us our next charm, and it is the Simic Charm, of course. Simic colors, instant speed, 3 modes. Target creature gets +3/+3 till end of turn. So there's some offering of combat shenanigans. Or permanents we control gain hexproof until end of turn. So it's not the indestructibility that Boros Charm gives us, but hexproof can work well, especially if we're trying to ward off any kind of spot removal. And then lastly, we can return target creature to its owner's hand. So we can use this for offensive capabilities by bouncing one of our opponent's creatures to their hand, or we can use this defensively by declaring one of our creatures as a blocker, and before it dies, we can bounce that creature back to our hand. Simic Charm gives us the flexibility in a lot of the different things that we're going to do, particularly if you look at target creature gets +3/+3 and not target creature we control gets +3/+3. When selecting these spells, particularly when it came to the charms, versatility reigns supreme, and I wanted as many options as possible for what we were going to do, and Simic Charm fit that bill. And lastly, the last Simic spell, and I'm going to talk about this prefacing the fact that I am not a proponent of counterspells. I, as well does my playgroup and my metagame, have a general disdain for counter magic. We want to be able to cast the spells in our hand. We want to be able to play with the cards on the battlefield. And in order to do that, we have to play games without counter magic. However, when appropriate, I can convince myself that it would be okay to include, if needed, a counterspell that fits the theme or the flavor of a deck, and that is the instance here with our last form of disruption for Simic, and that's Plasm Capture. Instant speed, 2 green, 2 blue, counter target spell. At the beginning of our next pre-combat main phase, we add X mana in any combination of colors to our mana pool, where X is that spell's converted mana cost. We're playing 5, or not, this is a 5-color deck. Every single spell is multicolored. So if we're able to get additional mana to help us cast that spell, to cast those spells, to fix our mana, and to prevent a potential threat from overtaking the game or, completely taking advantage of the board state, Plasm Capture is going to do that. It's going to help us to stop one of our opponents from winning the game, and it's going to help us get ahead by giving us the mana needed at the beginning of our next pre-combat main phase. Again, I don't feel great about including a counterspell. However, for the purposes of this flavorful build, Plasm Capture fits the bill, and it has to be included, and that's just the way it's going to be. It's just the way it's going to be, MTGBC. Don't slaughter me in the comment section. 1 in 99 is not a control deck built. All right, lastly, we're down to Golgari and removal disruption spells 19 and 20. The first offering from Golgari is Assassin's Trophy. Instant speed for Golgari colors. We destroy target permanent an opponent controls. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield. Now, I am not one to do anything to help out my opponents during a game. I am not group huggy. I am more group sluggy. And sometimes I have to talk myself into including spells like this just because I don't want to gift my opponent with a free basic land. However, in our format, we know that there are many permanents that can be extraordinarily troublesome or problematic, to the point where we don't mind gifting our opponent a free basic land if we're able to get that permanent off of the battlefield. That's what Assassin's Trophy does. And if we're lucky, perhaps our opponent doesn't have any basic lands in the 99 of their deck. That happens a lot more often than you may think. So playing with Assassin's Trophy is just too good of a card to not include in the 99. And I think we can not have to worry too much about gifting our opponents with one free basic land. All right, and the last form of removal disruption, card number 20, Golgari spell number 2. It is Pernicious Deed. It's an enchantment for 1 in Golgari colors. We may pay X and sacrifice Pernicious Deed to destroy each artifact, creature, and enchantment with converted mana cost X or less. So this is one of the ways in which we can completely wipe the board if needed. Not completely, because if you notice, absent from Pernicious Deed's text is Planeswalkers. This does not touch Planeswalkers, and in fact, in Super Friends deck, this is one of the best removal spells that can be included. So we can remove all artifacts, which we have none, but we will have creatures and enchantments. This kind of helps us to either keep our opponents paralyzed, have our opponents push the envelope so we activate Pernicious Deed, or we have a way in which to, let's say, creatively and with purpose, get rid of some artifacts, creatures, and enchantments that maybe they won't affect us as much if we're looking at, 3 or less, because we have a high number of beefy creature spells, and, well, we've got more permanent spells on the way. Either way, Pernicious Deed is included because, let's be honest, it is a versatile removal spell, and if we do happen to have Teferi or any number of the upcoming Planeswalkers, there's a spoiler alert for you, on the battlefield, wiping the board of everything but the Planeswalkers may be a great advantage for our game. The following group of cards is considered our advantage cards. These cards give us an advantage in cards, or life, or mana in one way, shape, or form, which are going to be utilized to out-resource our opponents. We have 10 different spells to talk about, one from each of the 10 guilds. Like previous sections of this deck tech, we'll begin with our allied colored pairs, and then move on to our enemy colored pairs, beginning with Azorius. We have Sphinx's Revelation, instant speed, X, white, and 2 blue, gain X life, draw X cards. So we have the advantage of gaining additional life, and more importantly, we have the advantage of more cards in our hand. Next up, we have Dimir, another instant, and this time it's going to be Lim-Dûl's Vault. For Dimir colors, we look at the top 5 cards of our library. Then, as many times as we choose, we may pay 1 life to put those cards on the bottom of our library and look at the next top 5 cards of our library. Shuffle all but the top 5 cards of our library, put those 5 on top of our library in any order, and effects that prevent or redirect damage cannot be used to counter this loss of life. So we have the advantage of not only digging through our deck to find the one card that's most important to us at the time that we need to draw it, but we also get to set up the 4 cards following that much needed card as a way in which to gain an advantage over what we're going to be getting into our hand. Next up is Rakdos, and our first enchantment of this subset of cards, and it is Theater of Horrors. 1 in Rakdos colors, at the beginning of our upkeep, we exile the top card of our library. During our turn, if an opponent lost life this turn, we may play cards exiled with Theater of Horrors. We can pay 3 in a red to deal 1 damage to target opponent or planeswalker. So at the beginning of our turn, each time that we have an upkeep, of course, we are going to exile the top card of our library. This is going to give us the advantage of giving us an extension of our hand in the form of exiled cards. Now, we can only cast these spells if an opponent has lost life this turn. However, Theater of Horrors has a built-in pinging ability, a little expensive at 3 in a red, but it does reach opponents or planeswalkers if needed. So we do have the versatility of getting additional cards to cast as long as we meet the conditions to do so. Next we have Gruul, and we have Reap the Past, sorcery speed, X and Gruul colors. We return X cards at random from our graveyard to our hand, and then we exile Reap the Past. Again, we're looking at card advantage. Now, depending on how many cards are in our graveyard, the game board, or the game state, the state of the board, it's all going to be relevant to what you're looking for when you cast Reap the Past. However, it does give us card advantage, even though it is potentially random. Now, when I say potentially, I mean if there's only 3 cards in our graveyard, and we're going to pay, and X is going to be paid for 3, then we're going to get all 3 of those cards back. So card advantage is card advantage. All right, and our last allied color pairing, we have Selesnya, and that's going to be Mirari's Wake. Enchantment for 3 in Selesnya colors. Creatures we control get +1/+1, and whenever we tap a land for mana, we add 1 mana to our mana pool for any type that land produced. So we're going to have the advantage of getting additional mana, plus the advantage of giving our creatures a power and toughness boost. We got those big, beefy, evasive creatures flying all over the battlefield. That is the, those are our crown jewels in the combat department. However, let's not look too far past the token creatures that we can create from Una and the Locust God. Suddenly, those become 2/2 flyers in the presence of Mirari's Wake. All right, next we're going to move on to our enemy colors, beginning with Orzhov. We have Kaya, Ghost Assassin, a planeswalker that ETBs with 5 loyalty counters for 2 in Orzhov colors. We can 0 Kaya and exile her or up to 1 target creature. We return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of our next upkeep, and we lose 2 life. 2 life is minuscule in a format where we begin with 40. We can -1 Kaya and have each opponent lose 2 life and we gain 2 life. And we can -2 Kaya for each opponent to discard a card and we draw a card. So with respect to her minus abilities, we gain the advantage on life because we're gaining 2 life while each opponent is losing 2 life. And then the second minus ability, we're gaining a card advantage as our opponents are each discarding a card and we draw a card. However, the star of the show may be her 0 ability. If we have Niv-Mizzet Reborn on the battlefield, we can use her 0 ability to exile him, and then he returns at the beginning of our next upkeep. We reap the benefits of his ETB trigger and get more cards into our hand. Or we exile Kaya to reset her loyalty counters to 5 when she comes back into play at the beginning of our next upkeep. Or, if we also notice, it's up to 1 target creature. The target creature we do not have to control. So we could forever keep one of our opponent's creatures in exile limbo with Kaya Ghost Assassin, outside of it being one of our opponent's generals, of course. Versatility reigns supreme with this Orzhov Planeswalker. Alright, Boros is next, and we're staying with Planeswalkers, and this time it is Nahiri the Harbinger. 2 and Boros colors for a Planeswalker that enters the battlefield with 4 loyalty counters. We can +2 Nahiri to discard a card, and if we do, we draw a card. So that doesn't necessarily give us card advantage. It gives us the advantage of rummaging, however, by letting us get rid of a card that we may not need in our hand and hopefully draw something better. -2 for Nahiri, and we can exile target enchantment, tapped artifact, or tapped creature. And as we talked about earlier in this deck tech, exile is so much more difficult to bring back than simply destroying. And then lastly, Nahiri's Big Bang ability of removing 8 loyalty counters from her. We can search our library for an artifact or creature card. For the purposes of this build, however, we will not consider searching for an artifact since there are no artifacts in this deck. So Nahiri, for this deck, for all intents and purposes, reads search our library for a creature card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle our library. It gains haste. Return it to our hand at the beginning of the next end step. So we have a lot of different creatures to choose from. Our beatdown creatures, we can choose one of our auxiliary creatures. There are a lot of options for Nahiri's Big Bang, and it gives us the ability to seek out a tool from our library to get onto the battlefield for a hasty turn, and then right back into our hand. All right, next up we have Izzet, and we have Keranos, God of Storms, a 6/5 legendary enchantment creature god that is indestructible for 3 in Izzet colors. As long as our devotion to blue and red is less than 7, Keranos is not a creature. So a lot of what we said about Xenagos and Xenagos's devotion, as long as we have Izzet colors mana symbols less than 7, our opponents are forced to deal with an indestructible enchantment rather than an indestructible creature enchantment. So, Keranos is included in the advantage portion of this deck tech because when we reveal the first card of our library, we reveal the first card we draw on each of our turns. Whenever we reveal a land this way, we draw a card. Whenever we reveal a non-land card this way, we get to lightning bolt something. A creature, a player, a planeswalker. So if we reveal a land, we draw a card. If we reveal a non-land card, we lightning bolt something. That gives us advantage from card perspective and removal perspective just by doing the basic card drawing at the beginning of our turn. All right, 2 advantage spells left. The next one, it is Simic. And it is Tatyova Benthic Druid, a legendary merfolk druid. She's 3/3 for 3 and Cynic colors. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we gain 1 life and we draw a card. Playing lands is one of the basic fundamentals of our game. So in order for us to have such an advantage of drawing a card and gaining a life each time we do that, not including Tatyova, well, that would be criminal. And our last, from the Golgari offering, our final form of advantage, is Treasured Find. This is a sorcery for Golgari colors. We return target card from our graveyard to our hand, and we exile Treasured Find. This is sort of a regrowth that we have to exile and costs 2 colors instead of 1. However, the advantage of bringing any card from our graveyard to our hand makes this choice from Golgari the form of advantage that we want in the 99 of this Niv-Mizzet deck. Our final group of spells for this deck tech is referred to as our enhancement spells. These 10 spells, one from each guild, have been selected as ways in which to enhance our primary, secondary, and tertiary win conditions, which are combat, combat, and combat. So each one of these spells, we're looking at a primary source of combat enhancement. Now, some cards may be chosen based upon the additional versatility they provide outside of just being a combat enhancer. We'll see that as we traverse through this portion of the deck tech. Beginning with Azorius and working our way through to Golgari, our first enhancement card is Venser the Sojourner. Planeswalker for 3 in Azorius colors, Venser ETBs with 3 loyalty counters. We can put 2 loyalty counters on Venser to exile target permanent we own, and then return it to the battlefield under our control at the beginning of the next end step. More often than not, that's going to be Niv-Mizzet Reborn blinking so that we can reap the benefits of his Enter the Battlefield trigger. Now, for the purposes of enhancing combat, Venser loses 1 loyalty counter and creatures are unblockable this turn. So if for some reason our big, beefy, evasive creatures continuously get chump block, Venser will make it so that doesn't happen during this turn. And then lastly, if we're fortunate enough to get Venser's emblem, we can take off 8 loyalty counters, and that emblem will say, whenever you cast a spell, exile target permanent. So Venser is included from the Azorius Guild because of his ability to make our creatures unblockable for a turn. However, the added versatility of blinking one of our permanents and returning it to the battlefield under our control at the beginning of our next end step, in addition to the potential of getting that game-breaking emblem, makes the choice of Venser in this slot undeniable. Next up, we have Dimir, and the Dimir choice is Vela, the Nightclad, a 4/4 legendary human wizard with Intimidate for 4 in Dimir colors. Vela gives other creatures we control Intimidate as well, and for anyone who is unfamiliar with the Intimidate mechanic, that means that creatures cannot block creatures we control unless they have the same color as that creature or they are artifact creatures. And because we have so many multicolored creatures in this deck, it may be difficult for our opponents to block all of them. Additionally, whenever Vela, the Nightclad, or another creature we control leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. That is a nice way in which to drain our opponents slowly over the course of a game, but make no mistake about it, Vela's Intimidate enabling mechanic is the reason why she's chosen from the Dimir Guild for this enhancement group of spells in this deck tech. Next up, for Rakdos, we have Grenzo, the Dungeon Warden, a 2/2 legendary goblin rogue for X and Rakdos colors. Grenzo, Dungeon Warden, enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. We can pay 2 to put the bottom card of our library into our graveyard. If it's a creature card with power less than or equal to Grenzo's power, we put it onto the battlefield instead. So we bulk up Grenzo by putting mad +1/+1 counters on it, and then later we can pay 2 and hopefully get a creature card from the bottom of our library into the graveyard and then eventually onto the battlefield with Grenzo's ability as a way in which to enhance our army for the purposes of growing our combat numbers. Next up, we have Gruul, and our Gruul representative is going to be Sargon Vol. 2 and Gruul colors for a Planeswalker that ETBs with 4 loyalty counters. We can +1 Sargon Vol, and creatures we control get +1/+1 and gain haste until end of turn. We can -2 Sargon to gain control of target creature until end of turn. We untap that creature and it gains haste. So right there with our first two abilities, this Gruul Planeswalker is going to enhance our ability to attack with hasty creatures. And if we're fortunate enough to get to 6 or more loyalty counters on Sargon, then we can create 5 4/4 red dragon creature tokens with flying. So Sargon Vol enhances our ability to attack with haste, and it has the potential to create a rather large number of evasive creatures. Our last ally colored spell for our enhancement section of this deck tech is Selesnya, and it is a Ajani, Mentor of Heroes. 3 in Selesnya colors for 4 loyalty counters when Ajani enters the battlefield. We can +1 Ajani to distribute 3 +1/+1 counters among 1, 2, or 3 target creatures we control. So right there we are enhancing the power and toughness of the creatures we have on the battlefield as we see fit. Either all 3 can go on 1, or we can spread them around. We can also +1 Ajani to look at the top 4 cards of our library. We may reveal an aura, creature, or planeswalker card from among them and put it into our hand. We put the rest on the bottom of our library in any order. So we have the ability to enhance our creature's power and toughness. Ajani gives us a kind of looting ability. It's a specific looting for creature, aura, or planeswalker, but as you've seen, that's pretty much going to be almost every non-land permanent in the entire deck. And lastly, if we get to 8 or more loyalty counters, we can take off 8 and gain 100 life. Ajani's versatility outside of his ability to throw around +1/+1 counters on our creatures is the reason why he was selected from the Selesnya Guild. All right, moving on to our enemy colored enhancement spells. We are beginning with Orzhov, and that's going to be Primeval's Glorious Rebirth, a legendary sorcery for 5 in Orzhov colors. Now, a legendary sorcery means that we can only cast it if we control a legendary creature or a legendary planeswalker. As you've seen up to this point in this deck tech, we are flooded with legendary creatures and legendary planeswalkers. And what Glorious Rebirth will do is we return all legendary permanent cards from our graveyard to the battlefield. They are plentiful, so this is going to give us every single planeswalker and every single one of our legendary creatures that are sitting there in the yard. That will give us the advantage of being able to enhance our board state by getting all of those permanents right back into play just by casting Primeval's Glorious Rebirth, as long, of course, as we meet the legendary sorcery guideline. All right, next up we have Boros, and this creature ended up replacing Iroas, God of Victory, in the Niv-Mizzet Up and Up series that took place recently. And for anyone that does not remember, that was General Ferris Rokurik, a 3/1 legendary human soldier for 1 in Boros colors. General Ferris Rokurik has hexproof from monocolored, so it can't be targeted by any kind of monocolored removal, monocolored effects, and it cannot be blocked by any monocolored creatures. Whenever we cast a multicolored spell, which is every spell in this deck, all 60 spells are multicolored. And whenever we cast one of them in the presence of General Ferris Rokurik, we create a 4/4 red and white golem artifact creature token. So we have an ability to, let's say, enhance our combat numbers by having Ferris Rokurik in play, and then we can cast some multicolor spells, or for the purposes of this deck, just cast any of our spells. We create 4/4 red and white golems, we enhance our combat numbers, and we just make it even more difficult for our opponents to win. All right, 3 left in this subset of cards, and next we have it is Joyra of the Gitu, a legendary human wizard for 2/2, and it costs 1 in Izzet colors. We can pay 2 and exile a non-land card in our hand from the game and put 4 time counters on it. If it doesn't have suspend, it gains suspend. This is going to give us the ability to enhance our board state, not by necessarily casting the spells for their mana value, however, by giving them suspend 4. So when they get exiled with Joyra, We're only paying 2 mana to do so, and then we're just waiting. So this is just a way in which to enhance our ability to get our creatures onto the battlefield more quickly, in greater numbers, faster than our opponents. Yes, they have the ability to see what's coming and potentially plan for it, but our creatures are so big and menacing that we invite them to do so. All right, next up we have Simic, and it is another Planeswalker, and this one is Nissa, Steward of Elements. She comes into play with X loyalty counters, where X is how much mana we cast, or is how much mana we spend after we pay the green and blue to cast Nissa. We can +2 to Scry 2, which is a great way to, filter the top of our deck. We can 0 her ability, and we can look at the top card of our library, and if it's a land card or a creature card with a converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of loyalty counters on Nissa, we may put that card onto the battlefield. So this is going to help us to enhance our creature numbers. This is going to help to get a land into play to enhance our mana base. Just zeroing Nissa, as long as we have enough loyalty counters on it to do so, and makes sense because of the number of big, beefy costing creatures we have floating around in the 99, zeroing Nissa is a way in which to grow our numbers steadily each and every turn. And then, if needed, and we have enough loyalty counters to do so, we can take off 6 and untap up to 2 lands we control, 2 target lands we control, and they become 5/5 elemental creatures with flying and haste until end of turn, and they're still lands. So if we need to push through with the final few points of evasive combat damage, Nissa can send a couple of flying, hasty elemental creature lands into combat. All right, and our last spell in this subset of cards, our Golgari Offering, it is Journey to Eternity, a legendary aura. We enchant creature we control for 1 in Golgari colors. When enchanted creature dies, and let's be honest, our creatures are going to be lightning rods for attention because of what they can do once they're out on the battlefield. When enchanted creature dies, we return it to the battlefield under our control, and then Journey to Eternity to the battlefield also is returned, and we transform it into Atzal, Cave of Eternity, a legendary land that taps for 1 mana of any color, but it also allows us to pay 3 and Golgari colors to return target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. So this gives us the ability to enhance our board state through direct graveyard to battlefield recursion once this transforms. Additionally, if we're able to put Journey to Eternity on Niv-Mizzet, and once Niv-Mizzet dies, Niv-Mizzet returns to the battlefield, well, we just got to gain another benefit of reaping the rewards of Niv-Mizzet's Enter the Battlefield trigger, restocking our hand and just making sure that we have the spells that we need to continue to cast and win the game. And now we come to the conclusion of this deck tech by reviewing the land base. There's not a lot of thrills, spills, or chills when it comes to this land base. We're trying to stay on flavor with as much as we possibly can with respect to the guildness of the deck. So, with that being said, this is a true singleton EDH deck, meaning that there are no multiple copies of any basic lands throughout the 99. However, and as I always want to point out, even in 5-color builds, you always want to make sure you include at least 1 basic land of each type. In so doing, you make sure that you reap the benefits of any opponents who may decide to Path to Exile one of your creatures, and you can go and get a basic land. Or maybe one of your opponent's Assassin Trophies one of your permanents, you can go get a basic land. Or maybe one of your opponent's Field of Ruins one of your non-basic lands, you can go and get a basic land. It's always a safe idea to include 1 basic land of each type, minimally in each 5-color deck, and this deck is no different. So, to start off the land base, 1 basic land of each type. To continue with the flavor of this guild build, we are going to include all 10 check lands. These are dual lands that come into play untapped if they meet the condition of having a specific land type in play at the time that the land enters. For Glacial Fortress, it's our Azorius check land, so it needs to see a plains or island for it to become untapped when it enters. If it doesn't have a plains or an island, it's going to ETB tapped. We have all 10 check lands present here. We're trying to keep the flavor of the guilds as close to 2 colors as we can possibly do. Again, with the exception of including 1 basic land of each, and a few other exceptions we'll see at the close of this video. So if we're going to play with all 10 check lands, well, we're going to also want to make sure that we play with all 10 shock lands. All 10 are here. They enter the battlefield tapped unless we pay 2 life, and if we do, we get to untap them, and we have all 10 included in this mana build. In this land build, in this deck, I should say, as the land base of this deck. All 10 shock lands. So we have 5 basics, 5 chuck lands, and 5... I'm sorry, I said that. Let's try this again, where the numbers actually make sense. 5 basics, 1 of each, 10 chuck lands, 10 shock lands. So we're up to 25 lands, 14 to go. As a way in which to try to fix our mana as best we can, because we are not playing with any mana rocks. So that's going to be a bit of a downgrade to the ability of being able to fix our mana, particularly in a deck where every single spell is multicolored. So we are going to play with the full amount of fetch lands. We got all 10 fetch lands, all of which can fetch out our shock lands first, leaving our basics in our library if we need to get them based upon one of the effects that our opponents may cast on us. Like we talked about earlier with Path to Exile, Field of Ruin, Assassin's Trophy. So all 10 fetch lands are included as a way in which to help fix the mana. So that's 35 lands. We're left with 4 more lands, and we're just going to make sure, again, that we can try as best we can to uphold the guild flavor of this deck. But we also know that the fundamental deck building principles of trying to have as much varied colored mana as possible to cast these spells. With that being said, we are going to play with the best land in the format, the Command Tower. This is going to give us 1 mana of any color, and we're justifying its inclusion by just saying, look, we are not trying to build one of those uber powerful, warped or deranged Niv-Mizzet Reborn builds where it just continuously enters the battlefield and you draw nearly your entire deck. We're having a fun, flavorful guild build, but we need to include a few lands like Command Tower in order to do so. That will give us 1 mana of any color. The next land, Reflecting Pool. Now, if we're lucky enough to have Reflecting Pool on the battlefield with Command Tower, then Reflecting Pool, for all intents and purposes, will be Command Tower version 2.0. If not, then we're going to tap it to add 1 mana to our mana pool of any type that a land we control could produce. So that will help us to not necessarily fix our mana outside of being able to pair it with a Command Tower, but it'll help us to cast some of those multicolored spells that might have more than 1 of the same colored mana symbol in the spell's mana cost. The next card is an absolute perfect card for this build, and in fact, it is considered Command Tower number 2, and that's Pillar of the Perins. We tap this to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool, and we spend this mana only to play a multicolored spell. As we've said numerous times throughout this deck tech, every spell in this deck, all 60 spells and our commander, are multicolored. So this is Command Tower number 2 for the purposes of this deck. And lastly, card number 99 to finish off this deck tech and complete our guild build around Niv-Mizzet Reborn, we have Exotic Orchard. Now, it is very unlikely that we're going to sit down to a table full of EDH players and everyone's playing a colorless build. So Exotic Orchard is going to give us some colors needed to help fix the mana in our deck. Whether or not we get all 5, well, that's going to be up to the decks that our opponents are playing. However, Exotic Orchard's versatility seems like it could be, rationalized enough for inclusion in this deck. Now, I will say that moving forward, maybe a card like Mana Confluence or City of Brass may be better inclusions than Exotic Orchard if we can stand the loss of life that we have to take by tapping a Mana Confluence or a City of Brass. However, again, Exotic Orchard has not been a failure of an addition, so we're going to keep an eye on that as potential for maybe enhancing or strengthening the overall playability of this build and making it maybe borderline flavorful slash semi-competitive. But I will say, in the history of this Niv-Mizzet Reborn deck, we've won more games than we've lost. And there you have it, MTG BC. This is the Niv-Mizzet Reborn EDH deck. It is a guild build. The 60 spells are completely equally dispersed amongst the 10 guilds of Ravnica. 6 spells per guild, 10 guilds, 60 spells overall, with one 5-color dragon to lead them all. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.